I just want to start off tonight by welcoming everybody to this webinar. My name is Karen Lawrence. I'm the Assistant Director of this Case Western Reserve University Siegal Lifelong Learning Program. And I'm excited that we're offering this lecture, co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of the greater Cleveland area. And this is, I say this all the time, but it's always the truth, that it's really frustrating that we're all sequestered in our homes and apartments and these small spaces, but I'm so glad that we have Zoom to be able to continue talking to each other and learning and being engaged and being able to bring in amazing speakers like we have tonight to talk about these topics that are on the utmost of all of our minds, especially now. And so before I introduce our speaker tonight, I just wanted to go over a couple of little Zoom particulars. If this is the first time you've joined us or have been at a Zoom webinar. In a few minutes, I'm going to hide myself, and our speaker will share her screen to share a PowerPoint. You'll be able to see and hear her, but we cannot see and hear you. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you and want to hear your thoughts and your questions and all of those sorts of things. So there are a couple of different ways for you to do this. One is with the chat button that Michael is already showing us tonight. If you have any comments that you guys want to bounce off of each other or questions, you can go in there and type your questions and thoughts in there. And then there's also the Q&A bubble down below as well that you can type your questions in there. And really, this is one of the things that I like the best about Zoom, is that you don't have to wait until the end of the lecture to ask a question. If it comes to your mind, that you can type it in halfway through, and then it'll be there for Fran to answer at the end of the lecture. Okay, so with that, I will introduce our speaker. So Francis Floriano Goins is a partner at Ulmer Berne LLP and heads their firm's cybersecurity and privacy, as well as their financial services and securities litigation groups. She litigates complex business disputes, including matters involving cybersecurity, corporate governance, securities, consumer, and contract law. Her practice also includes counseling businesses on compliance and training for data privacy, cybersecurity, ethics, anti-bribery, governance best practices. And she serves as an arbitrator for the American Arbitration Association commercial and consumer panels, and has represented numerous clients in arbitration proceedings via Zoom. I found out the other day that we're doing everything via Zoom these days. She also is tapped by the Department of Homeland Security to speak on cybersecurity for them, and has lectured widely and authored lots of articles on cybersecurity and data privacy, including for Ohio's chapter of Bloomberg's Law. So I'm just so excited that we're going to have this talk tonight from her. And then to round it all off, which I love, she graduated with her Order of the Coif from Case Western Reserve University School of Law, where she was editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and she also has her bachelor's and master's in vocal performance from the Cleveland Institute of Music, and so is just a great, I'm very excited. So with that, I will hand it over to you, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
So thank you, Karen. Tonight we're going to talk about cybersecurity and how it impacts voting in the United States and also in Ohio. So I do have a PowerPoint, which if all goes well, I can put up on the screen for you. There we go. Okay. So, critical cybersecurity concerns in the 2020 elections. Historically, U.S. elections have been fairly impervious to outside interference. And that is because each Board of Elections runs its own show. Each Board of Elections has its own machines, its own polling places. It signs in, separately, counts its own votes, and they get amalgamated, but, there isn't any central authority that really runs the whole show. So today, however, with various portions of the voting process going online and on the internet, there's a lot more opportunity for interference. And we've seen that, in the 2016 elections. We've seen it in the primary elections this year. And we also see, something a little bit different, and that is the use of social media, which is, of course, another opportunity to use the internet to disrupt or to increase discord and undermine confidence in the democratic process. And I see there's a typo there. Anyway, so many people may not think of that as a cybersecurity issue, but it is in fact a way that folks, bad actors can disrupt our elections and can influence voters to change their votes potentially, or as we'll see, maybe even show up on the wrong day. So back in 2000, you may recall there were issues with what were called hanging chads and vote counts. And in the presidential election in 2000, and Congress passed an act to try and address that in 2002 that was called the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. And HAVA had three main goals. One was to replace the punch card and lever-based voting systems. The second was to establish minimum election administration standards. And the third was to establish an agency called the Election Assistance Commission, which could help local boards of election with their voting issues. HAVA had a number of requirements contained right in the act. And the first was to improve voting accessibility for individuals with disabilities. But the act also required computerized statewide voters registration lists and contained voter identification requirements, some of which have come under heavy criticism because they require, it would require people to present a picture ID, and many voters, as you know, may not have a picture ID. Those requirements have been somewhat modified, but there are states that still stick to the picture ID requirement. The act was also intended to improve the confidentiality of voting and also ballot revision standards for voting systems, and to replace the punch card or lever voting systems. And lastly, to assure that there were manually auditable voting systems that would produce permanent paper records. And we'll see in just a minute why that is important. But the trend today, there are a number of companies, many of them outside the United States, that have been touting online voting systems and claim that you can get everything online. And there are some issues with that. And one of the issues is that you may not have a permanent paper record, and so you may not be able to audit the results of the vote. And let's take a look at why that might be important.
Reports of irregularities with electronic voting machines in Lake County, Indiana. Some footage has just come in. Let's take a look. Nobody ever said this was going to be easy. Now, there remain significant voting problems that have not been addressed since the last election. Here to explain is a professor of computer science at Princeton University, Andrew Appel. So they haven't fixed all the voter-related problems.
Well, the problem with some of these computerized electronic voting machines is that there's a computer in them.
Oops. Sorry.
These reports of irregularities with electronic voting. So they haven't fixed all the voter-related problems.
Sorry.
Well, the problem with some of these computerized electronic voting machines is that there's a computer in them. And the computer will do whatever it's programmed to do. If it's programmed to add up the votes correctly the way the voters vote, that's what it'll do. But if it's programmed to transfer votes from one candidate to another can do that, because whatever program is loaded in the machine controls what it will do.
So you actually bought a couple of voting machines.
Last year, I bought a couple of voting machines on the internet used from North Carolina. And this year, a court in New Jersey ordered that the state provide some voting machines for me to examine to see if they can be hacked in that way.
And you did it. So we actually have a tape of that. Can we see it? So here you are.
Here, I'm picking a lock.
You're breaking the law.
Yeah. This I'm doing.
You're fast. So you're actually, what are you doing here?
Well, I'm going to install a new computer program in this voting machine that will cheat.
So you can program it to say to vote.
So right here, I'm taking out the old chip that has a legitimate computer program that adds up the votes the right way.
Right.
Now I put in the fake program that transfers votes from one candidate to another.
So you can actually rig a machine. So I could literally, the knockoff of that was actually a funny piece we did, but you can actually do a version of that where I vote.
It won't look like that. The voter, he'll press the button and it'll look perfectly normal to the voter. See, when those machines appear to malfunction, they're just malfunctioning. They're not cheating. If you're going to cheat, you're not going to let on.
Right.
So you press the buttons and it can count up whatever it wants to.
So I could say the thing that I voted theoretically for Barack Obama, I theoretically vote for him.
Right.
Damn it, I told him who I was voting for. I bet that shot.
Well, in the privacy of the voting booth, you can vote for whoever you want.
Right. Are you trying to influence me? But theoretically, I place a vote. That vote can be rigged so it is automatically attributed to somebody else.
That's right.
Now, how are we ever supposed to believe in a system where you can cheat so blatantly?
Well, what we should do is we should switch to voting on optical scan paper ballots. So you mark the paper, you fill in the bubble, and you feed it into the scanning machine that counts it. And then the scanning machine keeps all those papers so it can be recounted. The very piece of paper that the voter filled out can be recounted. And then there is no place for the computer to cheat because it can't change what's on the paper.
You know what me and you gonna do? We're gonna hang out and drink. You need to relax a little bit. You dig this voting thing. Give him a big round of applause.
So you can see there that that sort of interference with voting, even though it uses computers, would be very time consuming and difficult. You'd have to go around to every single voting machine and make those changes. But that isn't necessarily something that has to be done these days, because large portions of voting are actually online on the internet in one way or another, and so bad actors, hackers, can go in and make the same sorts of changes over a broader spectrum. We saw, for instance, in the 2016 election that Russian government hackers accessed the DNC computer in 2015 and sent information back to Russia. And then there was, in March of 2016, there was what's called a phishing email. And that is, phishing is an email that looks like it's an official email of some sort, but it really isn't. And it's a little bit difficult to discern whether it's real or not. You have to have some training, and you have to look pretty carefully. In any event, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager did in fact check it out and tried to find out whether this was a valid email, but one of her advisors sent her a response and said it was okay, and meant to say it was not okay. But nonetheless, the campaign manager did click on the phishing email, and that allowed hackers to gain access to tons and tons of DNC staff emails, online chats, and oppositional research. And we all know that WikiLeaks then published close to 20,000 stolen emails. And ultimately, in 2018, the DOJ indicted members of the Russian intelligence agency, and that is still playing out. There was another event, or other events, I guess, though, that didn't garner quite as much publicity. The Illinois voter registration system was actually hacked. However, there was no evidence that anyone actually stole anything or changed anything in the system, although the hackers were able to access the system. And there were other voter registration systems around the country that were attacked, but which were not actually accessed. So in 2017, the Department of Homeland Security took steps to designate the election, what they call the election infrastructure, as a critical subsector of our infrastructure in the United States. And that's a job that's been given to DHS to try and figure out which portions of our infrastructure are important, so vital to the United States that their incapacity or destruction would have a debilitating impact on our physical economy, or physical or economic security, or public health or safety. And when this designation was made of election infrastructure, the DHS Secretary Johnson made a statement saying that election infrastructure is vital to our national interests, and cyber attacks in this country are becoming more sophisticated, and bad cyber actors ranging from nation states, cyber criminals, and hacktivists are becoming more sophisticated and dangerous. Now, what is the election infrastructure? Well, I found this chart on the government website, and it sets out the various pieces of the election infrastructure. The first part being pre-election activities. As you all know, voter registration can be handled in person, by mail, or online. And that requires that the Board of Elections personnel be trained and understand what they're doing. They have to process the materials, prepare the materials and the equipment, process the absentee voting, establish the voting locations, and so forth. On election day, there are tons of activities. The voters can cast their ballots either by direct record electronic voting machines, optical scanning voting ballots, or paper ballots. And the optical scan voting ballots are the ones that the Princeton professor was talking about, and they are what we use in Ohio, which is a ballot where you fill in a little oval with a pencil or a pen, and the machine then scans those ballots. Then the votes have to be counted and tallied, and they can be, again, they can be counted and tallied in many different ways, by machine, by optical scan, or by hand counting. And the results then have to be submitted on election night to the boards of election, which then submit them to the Secretary of State. And then finally, the results are tallied and released to the public, and the states conduct post-election canvass processing, including post-election audits, and and publish the results on election nights and certify the official results later. So the National Academy of Sciences also got into the act, and in 2018 they did a study of voter processes, and they were recommending a number of steps that should be taken to secure the critical election infrastructure. And the first thing was to assess the integrity of voter registration databases. You remember that under HAVA, all the states have to have unified voter registration databases, and in order to figure out whether those are secure or not, somebody has to test them from time to time. And so that's the assessment of their integrity. The National Academy also suggested that there should be a means for voters to easily check whether a ballot had been dispatched. That is, whether it had been sent by them, or whether the system showed that it had been sent by them. And then also provide a means for them to easily check whether their marked ballots had been received and accepted by the Board of Elections. And lastly, the National Academy again suggested that in-person voting utilizing readable paper ballots capable of being independently audited was the hallmark of a really good election system. Okay, so the federal government stepped up again. In 2018, Congress passed the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Act, creating the creating an agency called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency. And its services were to be available to state and local governments at no cost, and in fact, still are available. The purpose of CISA was to facilitate a partnership between federal, state, and local government on the one side and the private sector on the other side. And the reason that the private sector is involved in that is because many of the internet facilities are still private. They're not government, they're not public. They're owned by various private entities, and the private sector and the public sectors need to work together to make this system secure. CISA also published best practices for securing election systems. And many of these best practices mirror best practices that have been in place for many years for businesses that conduct online business, and they include a number of items that would be familiar to anybody who works in this area. And the first thing is software and patch management, and that means keep your system up to date. Make sure that you have implemented all the updates and all the patches, because a number of huge data breaches have occurred because companies did not implement patch management or software updates. And the reason people don't do this is because you have to take your system offline in order to do it. And in industry, at least, you lose money while you're updating your software. So companies sometimes tend not to do it, but certainly in the election system, we need to do that. Log management, network segmentation. Network segmentation means that only people who should have access, who need to have access to a particular part of the system actually do have that access. So it's kind of a need to know. The problem with not having network segmentation was highlighted in the Target data breach a number of years ago, when all of Target's credit card information was stolen by hackers. And you may recall that, and the way that they got into the system was through Target's HVAC vendor, which for some reason had access to Target's entire system, including their credit card records. Blocking suspicious activity, that's something that you need technical support to be able to do that. Credential management means watch your passwords, change your passwords, make sure that you don't share passwords. And unfortunately, it's a fact that in some boards of elections, the administrators will share passwords, or they'll use easily recognizable, easily obtainable passwords, and something that makes it easy for hackers to get into the systems. Establish a baseline for host and network activity. That means figure out what normal activity is on your system, and if you see, and then you can tell if you're seeing abnormal activity, and you may find hackers are in your system more quickly than you would otherwise. Organization-wide IT guidance and policies. This is something that it needs to be done by every entity that keeps online records. And it helps if you focus on creating these policies, because that makes you think about what you've got and how you're going to protect it. Notice and consent banners for computer systems assists the public in making sure that they have the right system. If they log into the Board of Elections, for instance, they want to know, are they really on the Board of Elections? And if some use is going to be made of their information, they have a right to know it, and so you would want consent banners along with that. So what this means is that every Board of Elections administrator is now becoming an IT person, and I'm sure that many of those folks did not think that's what they signed on for. CISA also provides a number of services to the states and to local boards of elections, including cybersecurity and protective security advisors, cybersecurity assessments, detection and prevention services, information sharing and awareness publications, incident response assistance. So in other words, if you do have a breach, you can call CISA and they will help you get through it and walk you through it. And training is so important because many of the breaches that occur are the result, like the DNC breach that we looked at earlier, many breaches are the result of human error and lack of training. So, and as I said, humans are prone to error. So I'm going to just run through some of the problems that can be created when humans react to hackers. Okay, so first of all, I talked about earlier about sharing passwords and credentials. It's very important that every individual, every administrator, particularly in an area as sensitive as boards of elections, has their own password and that they don't share credentials with each other. It's also important to be able to recognize phishing attacks. And there are ways to do that. If you look very carefully at the email address that the email is from, you can often tell that it isn't exactly what it should be. You can sometimes look at the language and see that it is not it's not the type of language that the person who's supposedly sending you the email would use. Sometimes there are unusual typos, like the Nigerian prince spoofs. And, you know, there are ways to tell. Sometimes you have to go online and see if you can actually find a company that looks like the company, you know, that is the company that is supposedly sending the email. Spoofing is a little bit different. It's when a hacker pretends to be someone other than who they actually are. So in spoofing, what often happens is that a hacker will send an email that purports to come from, say, your boss, and in actual fact, it doesn't. It comes from a hacker in Russia or somewhere, and it says, you know, you should do this right away. It's urgent, and the only real way to get around that or to cure it is to make sure the spoofing emails very often look exactly like the real emails, and it's very hard to tell the difference. And so, you know, multi-factor authentication is a very good way to deal with spoofing, and that is pick up the phone and call the person who's telling you to do something that seems a little off base and make sure that it's actually that person who's sending the message. Ransomware is a huge area right now, and ransomware is something that basically what happens is a hacker will get into a system, will confiscate all the data or lock up all the data in the system. And imagine if this happened on election night to the voting rolls, and you couldn't figure out if people were registered voters or not. That would mean that all votes would have to be by provisional ballot, and you know, there might be time factors in terms of counting the provisional ballots, and it just could create all sorts of difficulties. So the ransomware hacker is usually going to get into a system, control the information that's in the system, and then demand a ransom. And usually the ransoms are demanded in Bitcoins, and not too many boards of election have Bitcoin accounts. So it could be really difficult if a board of election or a state voter registration log was accessed and locked up by a ransomware hacker. So just this year, we saw a number of situations in the Super Tuesday elections, primary elections. In Los Angeles, voting machines shut down and people couldn't vote. In Minnesota and Texas, the web traffic was so heavy that there was no access to state online information sites. In Iowa, the Democratic caucus had commissioned an app that would supposedly allow voting online on your cell phone, on your smartphone, and also allow boards of elections to report through the app, report in through the app. The app just didn't work, and so there were all sorts of difficulties with that, and it ended up taking weeks and weeks to count the votes in the Iowa primaries. In Texas, there was also a disinformation campaign of robocalls. And what happened here is that the calls went out to registered Republican voters, telling them to come and vote on the right day, at your regular polling station. But calls went out to Democratic registered voters or registered Democratic voters, telling them not to come to the polls until the next day. Obviously, that was, a really heavy-duty criminal event, and it is still being researched. Unfortunately, what happens is that the calls can be routed through, what appears to be a legitimate phone number in the United States, but that's actually a spoof for an overseas actor. In California, there were problems with electronic poll books, and the voting workers could not access the electronic poll books, and so they had to take, again, all provisional ballots. There was also a noticeable increase in digital probing of online systems, and the result of that was not that anything was stolen or taken, not that any votes were changed as far as anybody knows, and there was heavy duty research into that, so we're fairly sure that there weren't any changes in votes. But obviously there were bad actors out there, hackers who were trying their best to get into the online systems. So what do we have today? Well, we have a number of things that can be defined as internet-based voting. Not all of these are actual, the actual casting of your vote, but they're all collected under the rubric of internet-based voting. So 40 states currently offer online voter registration, and other states are considering it. This year, West Virginia, Delaware, and New Jersey experimented with app-based online voting systems. After the Iowa experience, at least 2 of these states dropped out, and it's not clear that there are going to be any states that are conducting any app-based online voting this year. And I was actually a little bit surprised to find out that most members of the military can vote online in most states, and in fact, that's been true for quite a long time. And it's probably the only way they could get their absentee ballots in with any degree of certainty or, on time. So, but it isn't, as you'll see from the next set of slides, voting online is probably not the way to go for everyone. So in May of 2020, there was another study produced by CISA, the EAC, the FBI, and NIST. NIST is the National Institute of Standards, which publishes standards for all sorts of segments of the manufacturing industry, and they have taken the lead in publishing standards for cybersecurity over probably the past 7 or 8 years. They examine the risks of three different types of online voting. The first part is ballots being sent digitally to voters. The second is ballots sent and marked online but printed out and returned by mail. And the third is ballots received and returned digitally. So the only real online voting is probably the third one, ballots being received and returned digitally. This group found significant security risks in many of these categories, but particularly in ballots being received and returned digitally, and concluded that hackers could change or block votes or undermine ballot security or ballot secrecy if ballots were, if actual online voting occurred. So they produced these great charts. And I'm not going to go through every piece of this, but you can see here that they've set out particular risks. And then under each risk, they've looked at the three different types of technology, fax, email, and the web. And they have rated the risk of each of the three segments of online voting, either low, moderate, or high. So for instance, let's look at unauthorized modifications to blank ballots, okay? If the electronic ballot delivery is by fax, this group said the risk was low. If it was by email, the risk was moderate. And if it was sent by the web, the risk was low. And you remember what we said about email. The reason that it's a moderate risk as opposed to a low risk is because email is so easily hackable, mostly because of individual recipients, mistakes or acceptance of phishing or other kinds of improper emails. With respect to electronic ballot marking, the group found that the risk was moderate for both email and the web. And this risk doesn't apply to electronic ballot returns, so it's not on here. But the next risk, loss of voted ballot integrity, the risk for all three forms of technology, fax, email, and the web, is high for electronic ballot returns. Ballot secrecy is something that we prize in the United States, and it is not an issue, according to this study, with respect to either electronic ballot delivery or electronic ballot marking, but it is a moderate to high risk with respect to electronic ballot return for all three of the categories of technology. And then this is one that I think is particularly important, and that is that an unauthorized individual participates in the voting channel. With respect to electronic ballot delivery, not likely that an unauthorized individual is going to participate. Not too likely that an unauthorized individual is going to mark the ballot, but with respect to returning the ballot, there's a high risk in all three forms of technology. And then here we see the last two risks that they looked at were broken chain of custody and unable to access system or obtain ballot. As you can see throughout this, the risks in the electronic ballot return are consistently much higher than in any of the other categories. So what can we expect in this presidential election? First of all, the Russians never left. So foreign actors are still a concern. We now have not only Russia, but China and Iran, who've been identified as trying to infiltrate our voting. We have disinformation and attempted cyber attacks. So two types of interruption. We have as we talked about before, social media attempts to undermine public confidence and increase discord. And the DHS testing has revealed what they call concerning technical vulnerabilities at the state and local levels, mainly because of inadequate local resources and IT support. Now, interestingly enough, the DHS said that most of these vulnerabilities could be corrected in time for the election. The problem is that there are not sufficient resources and mainly money to get this done. And certainly most boards of elections don't have the kind of IT support that would actually allow them to do very high level cybersecurity monitoring. So what are we doing in Ohio? Well, Ohio actually looks pretty good in comparison to many other states in the nation. HAVA funds were increased this year by $425 million. And Ohio's share is $13.7 almost million. The Secretary of State has allotted block grants to every board of elections in the amount of $40,000 apiece to support continued compliance with security standards that the Secretary of State promulgated, and was very happy to report, the Secretary of State that is, was very happy to report that every Ohio County Board of Elections has been a member of the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center since July 2018. That's important because the EISAC promulgates standards for conducting elections and for maintaining election infrastructure and information sharing. And if you're a member of that, you not only have access to all the information and resources of the EAC, but also you have the ability to use standards that have been reviewed by experts and approved, and you can be fairly sure that if you're complying with those standards that you're going to have a reasonably secure system. So what are the cybersecurity requirements for Ohio boards of election? Well, these requirements were set out in a Secretary of State directive in 2019, and they include a number of things, some of which we've talked about before, but DHS has some tools, and some of these tools are mandatory for Ohio boards of elections. First one is the DHS Phishing Campaign Assessment tool, which is to be used annually. And the second is the DHS Vulnerability Scanning tool, which is to be used weekly. And that shows a particular board of election. If you run a vulnerability scan, you can tell if there are holes in your software defenses, basically. And so that's important. The CIS Elections Infrastructure Playbook, laid out a number of items for each board of election, and some were designated as high priority items in the context of election infrastructure security. And those are to be addressed on a mandatory basis by every Ohio board of election in time for the 2020 presidential election. And also boards of elections are admonished to utilize the free DHS services for risk and vulnerability assessment, remote penetration testing, architectural design review, and cyber threat hunts. So basically all of these things, all of these items are designed to ferret out problems with a particular system. Penetration testing, for instance, is basically a white hat hacker goes out and tries to get into your system, and if they can do that, then you know that you've got a problem, and hopefully you can fix it. So in addition to that, Each Board of Elections is to use a domain name ending in .gov. And the reason that's important is so that individuals who are trying to get good information about voting and figure out, where they're supposed to go, for instance, what polling stations are going to be open, what the deadlines are, can be sure that they're going to the right website and they're going to an actual official government website and not to some hacker website that's going to give them incorrect information. Training, we talked about training. Annual cybersecurity training is very important and it is mandatory. Criminal background checks. I thought this one was kind of interesting because it's not one that you normally see in cybersecurity lists of things that you should do to keep your system secure. But it is very important, and that is to conduct criminal background checks for all permanent employees and also for vendors and contractors that provide sensitive services. Well, I won't give you my personal political views, but it's certainly important that we screen people who are going to be actually doing the vote counting and who are actually going to be running the systems. And this is one way to screen them. Excuse me. Domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conference to prevent spoofing. Okay, this is a service that DHS provides, and Ohio boards of elections are mandated to utilize it. And lastly, to immediately report security events to the Secretary of State's office. One of the items that the Secretary of State's office has taken under its wing is to keep track of certain security breaches and cybersecurity incidents and make sure that there are not patterns of these things going on and be able to quickly advise boards of elections throughout the state if there is something going on so that they can take measures to secure their systems. Last item, the state of Ohio does offer services, IT services to boards of elections. So first of all, they offer cybersecurity liaisons, which are people that you can talk to who can help you work through all the governmental requirements and tell you whether in fact you got the right protections in place. The state of Ohio will also provide network intrusion detection, which we mentioned a little while ago, which basically helps boards of election figure out if in fact they are vulnerable and if they've got weaknesses in their systems. The state will provide endpoint detection and response solutions. So if there is a breach, they will help you find out what happened, how long it's been going on, and help you fix it. And then lastly, malicious domain blocking. There are certain known domains that you can just keep from accessing your system up front, and then you don't have to really worry about it on a day-by-day basis. Okay, so that's the state of Ohio. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much. I know we already, where's my camera? What about COVID? Is there any wrenches does COVID throw into all of that? I'll adjust my glasses there.
Well, I mean, the gold standard for voting is to go there in person and cast your ballot. And many of the cybersecurity risks that we've mentioned are just eliminated if people are voting in person. You don't have to mail the ballots, you don't have to get them online, you don't have to submit them online, none of that stuff. So COVID is making things more difficult, for sure, for everybody. But I don't think it's impossible. And I think that, I think that at least from a cybersecurity point of view, I think we have, good systems in place, and I don't think COVID is going to change the landscape that much.
All right. Let's see, Ginny makes the comment that if you're suspicious about an email, that you can look at the details of the sender, and that usually the normal email is off by just
Right.
a little.
Yeah, if you hover your mouse over the email address of the person who sent it, or the alleged person who sent it, it will tell you some additional things about the sender that you might not see with your naked eye.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ohio's poll books are connected to the internet. Are they vulnerable to hacking?
Yes, I mean, everything that's connected to the internet is vulnerable, but I do think that Ohio has been good about, in general, about securing its systems. I think, notwithstanding some issues that we've seen with online systems that the state maintains, like maybe workers' comp, which hasn't been quite up to speed. I do think that there's been an effort made and funds invested to try and make Ohio's online systems secure.
Here's another question. The Secretary of State's website was hacked last February by somebody from Panama. I missed that. Do you know about this? And is there anything on the Ohio Secretary of State website that could compromise an election?
I'm not sure, frankly, whether the voter registration logs are kept on the Secretary of State website. I would assume not, because the Secretary of State website is an outward-facing public website that anybody can access. And so, it would not be the place where they would store information or be able to access information. It would have to be an entirely different system. That said, almost everyone's been hacked. And it's just kind of a question whether you know about it or not these days.
Oh my God, when you put it that way.
I mean, one of the problems with online voting is that you then would have to deal with the insecurities of every individual person's home computer system.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this today with people working from home in industries where, there should be some confidentiality. I mean, even, almost every business wants their stuff to be confidential. So, you just can't control what kind of system individuals are going to have.
Yeah. Which then sort of segues nicely to the next question, that do you foresee a time in the next, say, decade when we might all be able to vote online, or you think it's much further off?
I don't see that we're really staying that far ahead of hackers in general in the cybersecurity space. And so I would say not. And certainly every study that's been done is saying that you need to keep paper ballots, you need to be able to audit. You need to have something physical that you can count. And you can't rely on that computer system that had its chip replaced, or whatever.
Yeah. So in your talk, you talked about the white hat hackers and Ohio Secretary of State asking hackers to try to check the election results. Who are those people that they hire?
Well, they tend to be university types for the most part. Sometimes they're just really, really bright teenagers who have been hired by some agency, or
surprised it's not 5-year-olds
or a company. I mean, there are tons and tons of technology companies out there. Many of which are excellent, and that's their business. That's what they do. So
yeah. As a member of the Election Law Advisory Committee of the ABA, do you have suggestions overall for how we might improve the federal electoral process?
You know, there've been a number of experiments done on the electoral process, some successful, some not. But the big push by my ABA committee, the Election Advisory Committee right now, is to get more poll workers. And what the committee sees as critically important, you know, as I said before, is making sure that we have enough poll workers out there so that people who want to vote in person can do so. And
which again, with coronavirus is such a huge,
yeah, well, you're going to have to wait in line longer because you're 6 feet apart anyway.
But the line will move so much faster.
Yeah.
Is there an application for blockchain technology in voting?
I don't know of any.
Should we have a more centralized system in Ohio for voting, i.e. there are currently 88 different systems, currently one for each of the counties in Ohio?
I don't, you know, we're moving toward a more regulated process, but I do think that there still is a benefit from certainly from a security standpoint. There's a great benefit to having all those separate systems still. You know, it makes it much harder.
Harder to.
Yeah. And so what the Secretary of State is working toward, and I think this makes sense, is, you know, an administrative umbrella that says this is how you're supposed to do it, but still let every Board of Elections do it themselves.
And are there any special issues that we should be concerned about Ohio's vote by mail system?
The post office. I don't think, I just think everything is taking so much longer, and that is a COVID issue for the most part. A number of systems have been centralized in Columbus, and they're not handled by the counties anymore. And so, but you know, voting by mail is not one of those, but still what's happened is that the, you know, employees are not working at the Board of Elections for the most part. They're working out of their homes. And so everything is going to be slower. It's going to take longer to get your vote, you know, you get your ballot sent back to you because there aren't as many people right there doing it every day. And it's going to certainly take longer to record the votes and, you know, all that sort of thing. So I would say for all you voters out there, you know, the best thing you can do is take your ballot down to the Board of Elections and put it in the box yourself, because that will at least save one trip through the mail.
Yeah, and request it yesterday.
Request it yesterday.
Yeah, yeah. Have you looked, what about, sorry, let me read the question. Have you looked at Oregon, Colorado, Washington, Utah, strong vote by mail states, and how do they do it? How do you feel about their systems?
Yeah, I actually have not looked at their systems. But you know, I'm a strong believer in vote by mail. I don't see, you know, the president does it. I think we should all do it if we can. You know, I mean, I think it avoids a lot of complication on the day of and trying to cram that all in on one day. And it can make the system work much more smoothly if people, you know, request their ballots in time and get them in time and get them submitted. So I think voting by mail is great, you know, really, but I have not looked specifically at those states.
And are there any last questions? Any last contenders? Oop. Is there a job for a poll worker to help validate mail-in ballots?
I do not know the answer to that.
Hmm.
Do not know. I would guess, I mean, poll workers have, you know, I took training to be a poll worker, and for lawyers at least, it's a 4-hour course. And I can't say that after 4 hours, I really felt that I knew everything there was to know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when you're talking about, and mail-in ballots are processed at the Board of Elections, you know, they're not processed out at the polling stations. So they're mostly processed by people who have some experience and have worked as poll workers before.
Mm-hmm.
If not, if not by permanent employees of the Board of Elections.
Yeah.
It varies from county to county.
All right. I think that's it. So thank you so much. As Michael says, let's thank you and let's have a safe election. And so thank you for giving all of this information and for, I mean, I learned that it's really the more you know, especially this year and big election year, and it's all so many things to worry about. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving the lecture tonight. And everybody have a great evening and hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.